Welcome. I'm James Traub. I'm a journalist, but I have the great good fortune of also being a teacher here at NYU Abu Dhabi, both in what we call the Sheikh Mohamed Scholarship Program, as well as for students here. And so I'm very much part of the NYU Abu Dhabi family. And I have the honor of introducing tonight Martin Griffiths, who is our first Peace Fellow, the first of what we hope will be a long series of such figures. Martin is an extraordinary figure. In the world of conflict mediation, he is or perhaps the senior figure. Martin is now the inaugural head of an institution called the European Institute for Peace, a think tank created by the EU. But in the past, Martin has been a British diplomat, a UN official, and for many years, the head of an organization called the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, which does things that you never hear about unless they have success, and even then you probably don't hear about. It's an organization that, for example, mediated the long-running insurgency in the Philippines and finally brought an end to it, and in places all over the world has done that. And so this is the kind of experience that Martin has. And so Martin has been with us here this week, teaching classes and addressing a roundtable on a whole range of issues, the Arab Spring, Syria, and the like. And so he will be speaking this evening about a question which is very pressing for his organization and, of course, for all of us, which is what in the world can be done about the problem of Ukraine, and much more broadly about the problem of Russia, its relationship to Europe, and its increasingly conflictual relationship to everybody. And so Martin will speak for 20 minutes or so, and then he and I will have a question and answer session, and then we'll throw it open to all of you and be very eager to hear input from you. Before I sit down, I want to mention one more thing, that in 2 weeks, on March 9th, we will be having our next Peace Fellow, David Malone, who is the rector of UN University, which is in effect the kind of think tank for the United Nations, who will be talking about the Security Council in an age of geopolitical conflict. So I hope all of you will be able to be here then. So Martin, take it away.
Thank you very much. It's an enormous privilege to be here. I came on Sunday, and I haven't yet told the Vice Chancellor sitting in the front row, but I'm not leaving. It's just too nice. It's just too good. It's a great privilege to be here, and I'm very grateful to you. I'm also very grateful to Jim Traub. Jim is an extraordinary person with a string of literary of book successes behind him, and I came across Jim's work when I read his book on Kofi Annan, who is somebody I know rather well and have worked with a lot, and I'm a neighbor, in fact, of his in Switzerland. And I read this book on Kofi Annan, and I didn't like it that much because it really absolutely got him right. It pinned him. And so I knew of Jim as this forensic historian before coming here. And it's because of that, and because of that ferocity of intellect, that I'm going to make two caveats before I begin. First of all, that I'm going to speak, as Jim has said, as a mediator. I'm not a Russian specialist or a scholar, but I am a mediator, and I think I can speak with some authority in that context. And I'm going to speak also very, very clearly and deliberately from the perspective of Europe. As Jim has said, I'm the first director of the European Institute of Peace. For me, having spent most of my life abroad in strange places, it's oddly enough, at my age, the first time I'm at home, in a sense, in Europe. I'm finally European, which is an odd thought for a British person, but nonetheless, I think I'm one of the few. So I'm going to talk about the issue of Russia for us in Europe. And I'm going to describe it, if I may, from the perspective of the last few months of a progress of meetings and interviews and discussions and insights which I have had in coming to conclusions about what my institute in Brussels should try to do to contribute to improving understanding. So those are the two ways I'm going to approach this subject tonight. I'm going to couch it in some sense as a bit of a road movie, because the story of how we in the European Institute began to get to grips with the Russian Europe issue, the Ukraine issue, was through a series of encounters across my continent and with the set of governors that I work for. My institute was created by 9 European governments, all of whom are on my board and to whom I report. And they have helped me to come to some understanding of the issue. So I start back in September of last year, when I started work as the first director of this institute. And my background as a mediator was very much somebody, as Jim has described, involved in peace processes, peace negotiations. I'd spent the whole of last year working with the UN on Syria, very classic conflicts. And so when, and I was looking for what the Institute was going to do, trying to establish its program of work, of operational work. And so it came as a bit of a surprise to me when a woman in Brussels said to me, "You do know that Russia is the big issue for Europe. And as a European institute, you have to address it in some way." And my response was, yes, but I can't mediate between Russia and Europe or Ukraine, Kiev, and the separatists in the East. And she said, no, but you can try to do something a little bit different as a European public interest institute. You can try to improve understanding. And you certainly have an obligation to address this issue in some form. So that was my Belgian encounter. And I realized as a result of that discussion that as much as anything else, a public peace institute should not be just about promoting peace, but it should be a slightly different thing, which is improving understanding. And so our objectives in looking at the Russia-Europe problem is to improve understanding rather than peace. And as you'll see, Jim, when I go through this, peace, I think, is something that is a long, long way off. Looking at Ukraine, there are obviously 2 levels in which you look at the Ukraine conflict, as you do at any conflict. There's the immediate crisis, the immediate need that we see played out over the last week of the need for a ceasefire in the East, for a stand down, for monitoring, and then for follow-up political actions to resolve an immediate crisis. And then there's the underlying, that's crisis management. And then there's the underlying issue, the conflict resolution issue, if you like, which you need to address if you're going to have a transformative effect on the society which has been crippled by conflict. And Ukraine is as good a place as any to realize that those 2 levels are of equal importance. This is not a particularly original thought. Anybody who's spent any time looking at conflict knows you need to look at the causes. Anybody who's tried to mediate between parties, as I have, knows that they will spend a lot of time, quite rightly, telling you about their history and why they got to where they are today. What is striking about Ukraine, if you look at it from a European perspective, is how little we Europeans, I would claim, are looking at the underlying causes of how we got there. So we're looking at Ukraine very, very much as a crisis management problem. And it's an important problem to be looked at in terms of crisis management. But we are ignoring, as a continent, largely, the assessment and analysis which should get us to understand how we got here and what we might expect if we can manage this particular crisis. And that I find startling. I find that startling in a European environment, a rather well endowed financially, a great bureaucracy in Brussels, but still very much focused on the immediate. And this thought of the fact that we're not addressing Ukraine in a holistic way took me to Germany. Berlin is kind of coming out, really, as a European leader. We've seen this, of course, very, very clearly in the case of Ukraine, very, very clearly over the last few weeks of diplomacy led by Chancellor Merkel. But Berlin is also coming out as a European leader in many, many different ways. We've seen it in the Eurozone crisis. We also see it, interestingly now, from my profession, but the German government is beginning to invest massively in mediation. And so it was important to me, Germany is one of the my governors to go to Berlin because, of course, Berlin and Germany was where we saw many of the different European responses to Ukraine play out. We were all worried, I remember this last year, whether Angela Merkel, with her background, of course, in Eastern Germany, background in the same city as President Putin in his early days as a Soviet intelligence officer, whether she would be accommodating or confrontational, whether Germany and German business interests allegedly would shift Germany towards engagement as opposed to confrontation. And in fact, I discovered that all of this was true. And I went to Germany, and the first person I talked to me about appeasement, talked to me about the fact that for many people in Germany who believe in engaging with Russia are accused of being appeasers. And of course, this is a term which for many of us, has some unfortunate resonance, and that's also possibly why it's used. So there is a division within German society, and as you will see, it's not solely in Germany. But it's also true that Angela Merkel led a united Germany and continues to lead a united Germany, including business interests, in her policies that she has led us in Europe towards trying to resolve with both punitive measures and diplomacy the particular Ukrainian crisis. So Germany represented for me both aspects of the European ambiguity, if you like, over Russia. The German government is a coalition government, as you know, with Angela Merkel more on the right, the Steinmeier, the foreign minister, on the left, more in favor of engagement. And there is a debate. And we saw in the Munich Security Conference, which took place at the very beginning of February, this debate played out. We saw an extraordinary display, I was there looking from above, of bad manners in essence, of jeering at the remarks of Foreign Minister Lavrov. We began to see something of what Europeans feel behind the good manners of diplomacy about what's going on in this most recent war in our continent, finally in our continent. The other thing that I was told very, very clearly and strongly when I was in Berlin was that we should look back at recent history. I'm going to try an Irish joke here, and if it doesn't work, I know it's a bit of a risk, right? And I don't know if you know that a man is crossing the countryside of Ireland and he's looking for a village, and he's lost. And he stops because he sees this old Irish farmer on the side of the road, and he asks the Irish farmer, of course this is the way English people think about the Irish, he asks the Irish farmer, how can I get to the village of X? And the Irishman pauses and looks at him and says, well, I wouldn't start here. And that's what I was told in Berlin about Ukraine. Don't start here. You have to go back. And you have to go back for about 15 years. This is the argument. And I think there is an argument about it, and I expect we'll have one. 15 years in which President Putin decided that his efforts to build bridges to the West resulted in dismissive contempt. And we see many, many examples of that. And I myself had some experience of some of them. I was in Kosovo, in Macedonia, on the borders of Kosovo, on the 12th of June, 1999. Sergio Vieira de Mello, the UN senior official who'd been appointed by the Secretary General Annan to lead our mission into Kosovo, had flown in from New York, and we together went to see General Mike Jackson, the head of NATO forces in Skopje, who would eventually lead the NATO forces that same day into Kosovo. And you remember this story, and I remember hearing it vividly myself, when Mike Jackson famously said, I'm not going to start World War III, because the Russians, angry at what they saw as Western imperviousness, as NATO imperviousness, sent their troops in from Bosnia in ahead of the NATO forces, and as you remember, they occupied the airport in Pristina. And Mike Jackson was allegedly ordered to engage with them. And he famously said, I'm not going to do it. The airport of Pristina is not worth the Third World War. And he didn't. And eventually the situation after many months was resolved, with the Russian forces being contained in that small airport area. And the Kosovo crisis continued to be irritating for Russia with the efforts of Kosovo eventually successful, as we know, for secession. Libya, of course, was an even clearer case, where the Russians had kindly not vetoed the resolution put forward by Western powers to provide military operations against President Gaddafi, and were then, as they put it, as they thought it, traduced because it turned into a regime change operation. Missile defense in 2010, another example. The Russians put forward a proposal for new European security measures and were dismissed out of hand. I'm speaking as a Russian, of course, here. And this is important for me as a mediator because my job is not to choose very much between parties. Georgia, of course, in addition, where the Georgian forces attacked South Ossetia, and then finally the Western approaches in Syria, where the Russians berated, I remember well, because I worked for him at the time, Kofi Annan, who went to Moscow in April, May of 2012 to have a 1-hour lecture from Foreign Minister Lavrov on the content of international law, something that Kofi Annan is actually fairly familiar with. But Lavrov was making the point that the West was applying double standards and was breaching international norms. And he had a good case. This bumpy road, leads us, of course, to where we are today in Ukraine. So the point about dealing with the Ukraine issue is you have to start in history, just as you always do. It doesn't change your crisis management, and we'll come back to that, but it does change the way you look at the future. Two further points, perhaps, if I may, before moving on around Europe. There remain still areas of good cooperation between the West and Russia, and Europe and Russia. It isn't all a black and white story. I actually believe, contrary to what, in a sense, I was just saying, that the US-Russian cooperation on Syria has not been so negative. They have both collaborated on the Geneva process. The US supported, a little bit tepidly, but they didn't criticize the Moscow process of talks recently. There has been cooperation on the issue of Iran, and there has been at least no non-cooperation on the issue of counterterrorism. There still remain areas of cooperation. The second point, we were talking about this the other day during preparation for this evening, is a different one. And it's one that many scholars have made about the road to Ukraine. And that President Putin's return to power as president, he came with an ideology, he came with a purpose, he came with a domestic policy, which also has governed the way in which his foreign policy decisions have been made. So Ukraine is not just about us, it's about them. And it's about a sense of pride, hurt, of course, by the events I've described, and it's also about a reordering of values. And this, I think, is something which we really need very carefully to take into account when we look ahead. Europeans have, perhaps I'm going to exaggerate a little bit here, but we've demonized President Putin. Now, maybe that's right, but it's not usually a very useful tactic for conflict resolution to demonize your enemy. But we have done that, and we continue to do that. And as you will see as I go on, I think we have a great deal of self-criticism and self-awareness to learn. I've already referred to the fact that Europe is divided, and that the narrative between those proposing engagement and those opposing it is fierce. And I had a direct experience of that in my next country, Sweden. Sweden is the founder of my institute. the Swedes are good people, and I hope there are some here this evening. I'll speak freely then. It was a very interesting thing. Sweden is, of course, next to Russia. It has a long history of very careful management of policy, rather like Norway, rather like Finland. Carl Bildt, the extraordinary Swedish foreign minister, now not in power, no doubt he'll be back, has been absolutely vitriolic about Russia. He has led the charge in many ways, condemning Russia, not wrongly, quite understandably, for its actions in Ukraine. And so I went to Sweden, these decent people, and I'm a peacemaker, and they're funding me. And I said to a senior official in the foreign ministry, I said, well, don't you think it would be good if we should we talk about Russia? And I was lucky to emerge alive from that encounter. He hammered the floor. He told me that there was no space for this. Did I not understand that Crimea had been stolen by an illegal act? When I had a meeting later that morning with a senior politician, I had an entirely different version of events. And Sweden is as divided a country as all of our countries in Europe. And the divisions come most strongly the closer, of course, they are to the east. I want to put this, so Europe is split. We're not clear about engagement. As many people say, sanctions is not a policy, although it has an impact. We're focused on crisis management, and I don't think beyond the scholarly community that bureaucrats and diplomats have quite yet understood the dimensions and the ramifications of this crisis. And just to put it into a scary perspective, when I was in Finland, I keep moving around, Finland is a country which, of course, has a distinguished history of both opposition, war with Russia and cooperation with Russia. Many Finns said to me, this came as a big surprise. We thought we'd sorted out the Russian-Finland problem. We kind of went to sleep 15 years ago, and my goodness, here we are back. But I want to mention one thing that came out of those discussions, and 2 or 3 people have said it to me separately. And I mention it, I can't verify it, I don't think anybody can. But the point that was made to me was this. There's a lot of loose talk about the use of nuclear weapons. And there's a lot of loose talk about the use of nuclear weapons by Russian politicians and some Russian military. And the Finns, at least, who live very close, find that scary. And they said that if you look at some of the exercises, most of the exercises, the military exercises that take place in and around Ukraine, they said tactical nuclear weapons are part of the exercises. So, and this point about the danger of proliferation, the danger of this crisis getting out of hand, was one which was reflected also in an interesting public statement by Igor Ivanov, the former foreign minister of Russia, who I went to see in Moscow about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Ivanov is the kind of the people like us, the man you want to see to engage with as a sort of liberal representative of the Russian political elite, an incredibly decent man with an exceptional history. And I wanted to partner with his Russian International Affairs Council to convene a group of distinguished senior statesmen, diplomats, politicians who'd had direct experience in those events that I've described, the bumps in the road, so that by musing together in a safe environment, we could look at how we differed, Russians and ourselves, Carl Bildt, Igor Ivanov, Marty Ahtisaari, Tom Pickering, these people, to see why did we have such different narratives about these events, and how can we learn from this to try to reduce the shock value in the future. So I went to Moscow, and indeed Mr. Ivanov was very pleased to cooperate in this project. I had another meeting with a Western diplomat, and of course I was asking the questions, if we do these things like Track 2 events, or seminars with civil society, or the whole paraphernalia of public diplomacy, I said, is there much purpose to it? because we are, of course, in an environment in which the Russian government is cutting off Western assistance to many groups, as you know, the bridges are falling sort of daily. And a senior Western diplomat who is specifically responsible for public diplomacy said to me, you know, the thing about public diplomacy is you have no idea whether it's going to have an effect. But the Russian people, who he said, part of the program of works that his embassy has an extensive one throughout the country, have a need for it, and we should. So I took heed from that. So where are we? What I think we're facing here is a situation in which we can manage the crisis in Ukraine, we hope. I'll come to that. But we're facing a leader in Russia who's not going anywhere, who is immensely popular, who's created a rival ideology and a different set of values to ours. We in Europe are not coherent as to how we're going to approach it in the longer term, although there's a remarkable degree of unity about the crisis response. And we are slowly, we're floundering as to what we should be doing about this first crisis in the new Cold War. There are two efforts in Europe this year, coincidentally, to look at European security. One is run by a German former diplomat, Wolfgang Ischinger, in a panel that has been set up, which includes Russians and Georgians and people from the OSCE area to look at European security for the next year. And another is an EU panel to update the Solana approach to European security. I would say that these are two targets for peacemaking. These are two enormously important policy initiatives. And what do we need? What do we need those sets of policy discussions to establish for us? And I suggest maybe 4 different things. 1, we need effective crisis management. We have a remarkable alliance between the President of France and the Chancellor of Germany. It's working very well, but it's cobbled together. You know, the British, of course, are notably absent from this, as the British press has complained about. And it's not an EU response. We need a European-wide response, and we need to know how we're going to do diplomacy when the next bump comes, when the next crisis outside Ukraine in a different part of the world happens. And we need the EU bureaucracy to move into a diplomatic offensive. The second thing is we need to concentrate on the issue of truth. And we need, in our own countries, where we have many Russian speakers, of course, in our own Baltics and we need to provide opportunities for a corrective for some of the views that they may be hearing through Russian media. We need an engagement between media. There is a plan, and of course it's dangerous, there is a plan sitting on the table in Europe to devise a kind of new Russian service. But the danger of this is a kind of new Voice of America, a propagandist thing, which will not run. But we need to do it smartly, and we need to do it soon. We need to invest in Russian studies. We need to invest again back in Russian policy, in policy institutes looking at Russia. We need to put money into this. We need to bring policy specialists together. I'm told that Sweden and Poland have the creme de la creme, the cream of the crop in Europe. We need to engage, obviously, outside our continent on this. And finally, a fourth thing, we need to build the OSCE back, and I can talk about that in more detail. 2 final things, Jim. First of all, crisis management in Ukraine. The question of the presentation. We're hoping that this is going to work this time. You wouldn't put money on it. You wouldn't gamble on it. It's clear what needs to be done is on 2 levels. It's clear what needs to be done is to invest in good governance and foreign direct investment backing the Kiev government. The Kiev government has come in for a lot of criticism from many, many of its citizens and from journalists for its indiscriminate bombing in the east. We need to try to make them the good guys. And we also separately need to define the maximum limits of autonomy that we here being, of course, the Kiev authorities, and we need to maintain sanctions. While maintaining sanctions on Russia, we also need to much more carefully assess the economic impact of the combination of the oil prices and sanctions, which are, as we believe, but it's very vaguely understood in official circles, is having an extraordinary impact on Russian society. In conclusion, 5 points. The media issue, the crisis management issue, is of course the priority. It's the key for the sake of human lives, but it's also of vital importance because of the danger of proliferation. We have to resolve the issue of identity in eastern Ukraine. And I believe that it's possible that we will do it through this current initiative, but we need, as we are, to maintain our vigilance in terms of the punitive measures. Secondly, the Ukraine crisis is a brutal lesson teaching us about this new adversary we have in the Kremlin. And it is the beginning of a war. It is the beginning of what one president, head of state, European head of state, in the Munich conference called a cold peace. This is the beginning of a new period for us. And my third point is it's going to get worse, probably. And it's not going to stay in Europe. I'm sure they're going to be some of the things that we saw in the past in the Cold War. I'm perhaps being a little bit provocative, through surrogates. This will influence conflicts, as it has in a sense in Syria. So we need to understand this is a long, long haul, which is why our security mechanisms and our investments need to be long-term. Fourthly, interestingly, in my view, this is not a war about money or resources. Yes, of course, there are issues. Energy is one of the obvious ones that is often talked about and is actually a catalyst of conflict, the recent Bulgarian events. But actually it's a war about power and values. And President Putin has made it a war about values, and it's made it a war about power. And I fear, as I say, that for Europe at least, we're not prepared on the issue of values, and we're not very prepared on the issue of identity, because we're also trying to grapple with the events of Charlie Hebdo in Paris. So we have two assaults on our concept of identity, and we have two assaults on our concept of tolerance, and we have two assaults on our concept of judgment. So this is for the long term. It's a difficult, difficult issue. We may or may not have contributed to it. In my view, it doesn't matter. But what it does matter is that we have to build we have to build back coexistence, even if we're not going to achieve peace. Thank you very much.
Well, Martin, that was great. Thank you so much. And now let's argue. So I was actually very struck. I was trying to put together in my mind the place where you started, which is we need to understand why Putin is behaving the way he is and what it is the West and Europe have done over these 15 years to cause him to feel the way he feels. And then the place you ended up, where you said, we're in an adversarial moment. We need to accept that. We may need to feel the way Carl Bildt feels. So I'm not quite sure what your policy views are, so I want to tease that out, because it struck me that in the beginning, you were thinking and talking the way mediators have to think and talk, which is to say, it doesn't matter whether we think somebody has the right point of view. Yeah. If he has that point of view, our job is to move him somewhere, so let's just accept the fact that that's his point of view. Now, a policymaker may or may not choose to begin that way because he may think, I don't want to reason my way towards compromises that utterly violate our values or our national interests. So if for a second you make yourself not a mediator and make yourself a policymaker, and you say, Vladimir Putin believes that Ukraine has historically been an ally of Russia and a buffer between Russia and Europe, and he is not going to surrender that, and for that reason he has provoked hostilities in Ukraine. Should we say we're sorry he feels that way, but we understand that he has a right to feel that way, and should we be beginning from that recognition or deference to his definition of his own interests?
You're absolutely right, as usual. Very clever fellow, isn't he?
Now, don't try to change the subject here. He's buying time.
I thought I
it's
was
a classic
away there.
technique.
In the way in which I flit in this argument from mediator to European, actually. A very senior EU official who has spent most of the last 15 to 20 years dealing with Russia for the EU body, in part of the EU diplomatic service, answered your question as follows. He said, we have one red line, sovereignty. So to answer your question on Ukraine, he would say, if Ukraine decides they want to join the EU, they should be allowed to do so. Everything else, he said, and it's more important what he thinks than me, I think, although I think I'd go along with this, can be a matter of discussion. And there should be every effort, he said, to try to have those advanced discussions with Russia rather than surprising them. And he said, in fact, he said, in every case of the last 20 years, we in the EU bureaucracy have always gone to Moscow first before unveiling some new idea. We have religiously included them because we understand they have interests. What's happened here, and I believe this to be true, would be my view, is that Putin has, crossed that line. And he has breached international law. I'm with Carl Bildt on this, but and that's why I think it's absolutely right. And Europe, I think, is united in pursuing the approach which includes sanctions, which includes a very clear red line on sovereignty, and it includes punitive measures. And they're not backing down on it. And as I was saying in the presentation, Germany, interestingly, did not back down on that. So I'm with that. But the mediator comes back into frame when it's thinking about how we deal with the future. On Ukraine, I don't think there's much doubt. And even if Kiev, as any government involved in a messy internal conflict is likely to do, has done its own abuses, it doesn't excuse the manipulation that we see and what Senator Kerry, I'm sure, is absolutely correct and quoted today saying he's been lied to.
There's also a part of the fear, and this is a fact question to which we don't know the answer, but we speculate. Is Ukraine a one-off event from Putin's point of view, which that already poses its own problems, but that's a kind of self-limiting question? Or are those Baltic states and those Eastern European states who think that this is going to be his appetizer and they could be his entree, are they wrong, or is it reasonable to fear that Putin has yet larger designs and therefore reasonable to design our response to make it as unmistakably clear as possible that he is not entitled to those ambitions?
Well, I do. I mean, I'm of the view that we ain't seen nothing yet. That this is the beginning of a very, very difficult time.
So talk about what other, in your scenarios, what else is out there?
Well, I mean, if you talk to Lithuanians, they're constantly talking about the overflights. I'm not sure that he would be trying to, undermine Lithuanian states, although we in Europe have a worry about our Russian-speaking citizens in the Baltics. But there are enough of those frozen conflicts, which the OSCE has been dealing with, Moldova, Georgia. It's not an area of great that I know very well.
But there's Nagorno-Karabakh, in Armenia, and Transnistria, and so forth.
There's opportunities there, very, very clearly. So that I think we can expect. I'm not convinced we can expect direct action
like we have in Eastern Ukraine.
We should also expect one of the places which my institute happens by chance to be working is Macedonia. It's a whole different problem, of course, of Macedonia and Greece. But one of the Macedonian issues is whether they would like to be able to join NATO. And Russia has a very clear interest there. And it's the Slav interest as well. So we can see that there will be strong Russian interest in various parts of our periphery. I think what I haven't thought about, but which I think we should think about, is Russian interest beyond the periphery. We know Syria, right, because we deal with it. But where else could we imagine that there may be difficulties? That I think would be. And then, of course, there's the whole area, which I haven't touched on because I'm frankly ignorant, and it's not really my field, of the economic ties and the business of energy supplies and so forth, which is interestingly dormant, I think, as an issue over the last couple of months.
But that may be because, I mean, I think...
Because others have gone up, I think.
Well, yeah, and that, but also, in a way, the silver lining in all this is that Russia's economy is so oil dependent that the collapse of oil prices is a catastrophe for them, and for Russia, when they have not been using the weapon of weaponry, that's unusual for them. The weapon they use is the weapon of oil and natural gas. Yeah. And if prices collapse, then Russia's ability to do mischief may actually be seriously diminished.
Yes, and I suppose that's why we haven't seen it. And it's also, as we were saying earlier, an extremely important factor for the Russian economy, which is in very, very dire straits. I was hearing statistics in Finland from the National Bank of Finland, which studies it very closely because of the trade connections. Quite remarkable free fall, and no way back. No way back. So, and as we know, and as scholars here in the room will tell us, this doesn't mean to say this will not lead to a change of leadership. The Russian people are very well able to survive these tribulations.
But you said sanctions are not a policy. I understand you mean sanctions are an instrument.
Yes.
But it seems like actually in this case, sanctions could be the perfect policy because they are hitting Russia in a place where it is becoming weaker and weaker because of the collapse of their economy.
I suppose the people who say, and I would say too, that sanctions are not a policy, I was quoting the Crisis Group actually, which said that very clearly, would say that a punitive approach to Russia is not a policy either. And I would say that, wouldn't I? That's my argument, which is that even in the direst days of the Cold War, we still had to engage, coexist, and deal, and I think we still have to do that now. So to think that our instrument of choice is sanctions is not necessarily going to bring us any comfort. It's necessary, it's essential when we have a crisis management problem. And I think it's very interestingly how well it works, because I mean, sanctions have had rather a bad rap for good reasons over the years.
Right.
But I think they're not ineffective in this case.
Well, there's also a view that the only thing Putin understands is force, and you don't want to use military force, even though he seems all too prepared to, and so that may be that it's precisely the use of a coercive instrument that's going to get his attention.
That's exactly what he would say about us, by the way.
Yeah. Well, the fact that, by the way...
That's a mirror image of what he would say about us. Now, you know, I think, a mediator now, not European, you know, we are both right.
I can see you're going to shuttle back between
I'm going to shuttle back
as
and forwards
you.
before you... No, but, I mean, that is exactly what he says about us. And he says, and there's been an enormous amount of scholarship about this, that we have treated the Russians so dismissively, so insultingly, that, okay, well then it's only force that you understand. And, you know, we are changing our views.
But wait, so this does go to the difference between the mediator point of view and not just the policymaker point of view, the policy thinker, the intellectual point of view. Right. Yeah. So it matters. Or does it matter whether Putin is right in saying that? That is to say, this deep sense of aggrieved nationalism, which Putin has discovered as this vein that he can endlessly mine in Russia, and so it is endlessly repeated in Russian media. So, by the way, is something similar endlessly repeated in Syrian media, but that doesn't mean it's right. So I'm not sure if you're saying that we have to understand that Putin thinks this way, or you're saying Putin has good reason to think this way, and therefore we have to be changing our behavior because it's our behavior that's causing his behavior.
The known or something. Well, first of all, I think we have to examine our behavior because we need to understand what happened to get us here. I think that's a sort of a fundamental requirement. And we have been part of the story that's led us here.
Would you say, by the way, Martin,
it hasn't all been,
something like NATO expansion? Is NATO expansion an example of something which the West did heedlessly without recognizing that it would inevitably cause a backlash in Russia, and in retrospect, it may have been a mistake or went too fast?
Well, people say that. Certainly not a NATO specialist, but there's quite a lot of argument which says that the NATO, more than EU actually,
yes.
the NATO has been insensitive.
Henry Kissinger makes this argument.
The way in which we've encouraged membership, where we should have been a little bit more sensitive. Back to your question, I think it is clear, like on Syria, Lavrov's lecture to Annan was probably 90% correct under international law. There are many occasions on which we have been clearly the agent of double standards. We need to understand this for our own benefit. I'm answering your question as a European citizen. We need to understand this for the sake of our own values. We also need to understand it because we need to understand our adversary, but it's a separate matter. We don't need to move towards the Putin nationalist view of the world, but we certainly need to restate what we believe in. And in Europe, I can tell you, maybe not the case in the United States, maybe not in New York, but in Europe, we're not really clear about that anymore. And one of what my main anxiety, if you like, coming out of a first look at the Russia-Europe issue is the damage it's done to us, not to him and not to Ukraine. That, of course, is primary. But the damage it's done to us in terms of our confusion and our values, I think is very significant.
So, of course, there could be an American response, which is, yeah, we know just what you mean, and we're very clear about our values, us Americans, and that's why we recognize in Putin somebody who is utterly repudiating those values, and that's why we're worried that you Europeans are going soft on this. And so there was a lot of dismay in Washington when Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande made a kind of last-minute dash in order to sign this ceasefire agreement with Putin to stop the fighting in eastern Ukraine in a way that turned out to be tremendously advantageous to the Russians and to their separatist proxies. And so from that point of view, you could say, well, actually, Europe's problem is that they're unwilling to take the kind of tough measures that actually might persuade Putin to stop.
Which is exactly why we get very cross with the Americans, you know?
That's why I'm here.
I know. But it's good because, who is taking the hit in business with Russia? It's not the American business, it's ours. Whose continent has this terrible humanitarian and political crisis? Ours. Who went to the extra step, this of course would be the answer to see if diplomacy could rescue it, in contrast to a risky, let's say at least that, policy which would be to provide lethal weapons? We did. I don't think Merkel or Hollande have got anything to be embarrassed about. Any negotiations are concessionary. You and I would, as observers of that negotiation, would, I'm sure, have agreed that allowing that period of time before the ceasefire kicked in was something which was disadvantageous to the poor Ukrainian soldiers who lost their lives. We're not in the room to see what the pressures were. But I don't have any apology about the fact that diplomacy was given another chance. It's terribly important, and I'm sure we'll agree on this, that Europe and the US, we're divided enough inside. We don't want to divide ourselves from the US. But what we do need to have a discussion with the United States, and indeed with the United Nations, is a degree to which, and I think this is a really, really important subject, the degree to which the new Russian values, the new Russian nationalist ideology, how far is that going to undermine, over time, the norms that we have all come to subscribe to? I would be very interested to know if people in this room have studied that. Certainly, speaking for somebody who was in the United Nations until late last year, we haven't, and we need to. We need to study it in Europe, which is why I think we need to invest in studies. I think it is a potentially huge weapon, much more serious over time than instruments of war. And it's being managed, as you know, extremely effectively. It's a uniting and identifying value.
So, Martin, you said that your focus, that you think the focus here is not necessarily on peace, but on understanding.
Yeah.
But obviously, you're also hoping to be able to establish bridges of communication.
Yeah.
So, what's your feeling about the extent to which and the way in which the Russians are biddable, talkable to, and about what?
I think it's very, very, very limited. I mean, I asked that question of a lot of people in Moscow, where you'd think they'd know the answer. And I you know, very dusty answers from Russians as well as diplomats. There's a very, very considerable diplomat who is the EU ambassador, incidentally, to Russia, former Lithuanian foreign minister, and understands the neighborhood very well, who is extremely pessimistic. And that was my point about public diplomacy. The Western diplomat who supports in these bleak times the concept of public diplomacy, when I said, you know, is it really having any, and he said no. And I think it's a very, very difficult operational question for people in, for example, institutes like mine. Are we going to waste money on this?
Yeah, that's interesting.
An answer that's given to me on this by a senior Finnish politician, and I always think Finland on these things are most Finns and the Poles are very interesting in our continent. He said, what we should be doing, let us not dream. Let us not be naive to think that at the leadership level we're going to make any difference. Let us not believe we're going to build any bridges, let alone make any difference at the leadership level. And certainly while Ukraine's burning, we won't. But what we should be doing through these sorts of public efforts is building back bridges at the level of different interest groups, journalists, civil society, business, these sorts of things. Again,
because they matter to Putin. They have the ability to influence.
But because we're going to need to have a relationship with Russia.
Yeah.
But nobody to answer the brutal answer that I kept getting was none of us are going to have an impact on President Putin.
Yeah, that is
which is very, very bleak
fear.
indeed.
That's frightening.
I asked, you know, what a mediator does in these circumstances is always do, in a sense, what an intelligence officer does is who is Putin listening to, and can I talk to that person? You know. How close can you get? Nothing.
Yeah, on that subject, I was recently hearing a very senior American intelligence official who made the following comment. He said, you know, what frightens me, he said, and this is more, I think, from his reading than any special knowledge he has. He said, Putin, he said, what does he do during the day? He gets up, he works out for 2 or 3 hours by himself, he has lunch often by himself, he sees a few cronies in the afternoon. He said, my fear is that this guy is so isolated that he can make the kind of miscalculation that dictators make, you know, that Saddam Hussein made, because they're in a tiny little echo chamber.
Do you know, just to reinforce that, and I'm sure people here would know that in detail, a Russian specialist said to me, something which I thought was chilling, rather like that, said that normally the approach to new foreign policy ventures as practiced by the Russian leadership is that when a new idea has come out, like it might be a Ukraine idea, it's ventilated with a few picked policy institutes in Moscow. And it's discussed, and there's a process of consultation. And you know, then the leadership takes its decision. So what was absolutely extraordinary was that in case of Ukraine, there was no such consultation. And everybody I spoke to said that the contracting nature of the circle around Putin is alarming. Igor Ivanov himself, who is a very senior figure in Moscow, you know, makes no claim to have much access to the president. So we are facing we're facing a bit of an Assad situation in a way, you know, where we don't really know what President Assad wants to do, and it's very difficult to get to him. And I think we're facing that. And in conflict management terms, that's enormously dangerous.
So is the right metaphor, because you said you used the word Cold War.
Cold peace and Cold War, yeah.
Both, yeah.
Yeah.
So is the right metaphor containment? That is, the premise of containment is we're not going to do there may be some areas of overlap, but we're not going to bring him towards us a little bit. We recognize that he is going to be a dangerous figure, and therefore we have to decide where we're going to let him get away with stuff, Crimea, because we can't undo it, and then other places where we can't let him get away with stuff, like redrawing the boundaries of Ukraine, and we have to be aggressive on those.
Well, I think it is containment, and I think what that requires is a whole series of different instruments and sets of analysis. We need to be, as you were suggesting earlier about the red lines, we need to be extremely clear both in policy terms and then in public terms what our red lines are, and we should stick to them, unlike we did in Syria. So we need to be very, very careful about that. And I think that's where these two reviews of European security are going to be of enormous importance. So we should specify that. And by the way, that should be both those policy processes will be inclusive and consultative, and so we need to put it.
Do you have a sense of what red lines you would draw?
I think sovereignty is one. Yes, I think sovereignty.
So, meaning the violation of Ukrainian sovereignty has to be treated as utterly unacceptable, and it must be reversed.
Yes, and it's not going to be reversed in Ukraine. But as you said, but what I think what this EU official was saying here was that he was looking prospectively. Mm-hmm. We cannot tell Moldova that they can't join. You know, it's that, the sovereign decisions of governments. That's the first thing. I think the second thing is to re-intensify our efforts to reinforce the democratic and good governance processes in countries which we are protecting, because it's otherwise a fifth column, and that is a problem in Ukraine, there's no doubt about that.
So by that you mean sort of shaky Balkan countries and things like that?
I think Macedonia, for example. I mean, absolutely. And also, you know, I think we need to take a very different approach to investment. I don't mean business investment, but official investment and assistance. Because, crudely put, but I do believe this, we're moving onto into a war. And when you're in a war, you do things slightly differently. You do things more urgently, but you do things also with a greater knowledge of consequence. So we need to do those things, and I think we also need to strengthen our understanding of the processes. We can't give up on trying to understand what drives the Russian people. They are enormously important to us. They are our neighbors. This is my continent now that's affected. And so we need to do a lot there. And I think the OSCE is a very interesting organization. It's became rather, this is an organization in which you have the US, Russia, European states, Caucasus, and they're all in there, based in Vienna. And it's frankly been a bit of a lame duck for the last few years. And of course came back into the fore because of Ukraine. And through leadership, I'm very proud to say, of Switzerland, and some excellent mediators from Switzerland. Germany is taking over the chairmanship of OSCE next year. Germany Resurgent is taking over that, and they will be receiving their German-led report on European security. That's a big process for us. And I hope that what will happen will be that the US, which is a full member of the OSCE, will use the OSCE as a means of diplomacy. Because there is an institution, it doesn't have a veto process, it's more a consensus process, it's more equal, and there's an institution which Russia remains engaged in. It will become much, much more important for a person in my position than the United Nations. Vienna is the place to go to, I think, next year, not New York.
Book your hotel rooms now.
It's a lovely place.
It's a lovely place.
Yeah. Who wouldn't want to go there?
So, Martin, I think, for the fact that you, as a mediator, end up using the word war is telling about your candor as well as about the difficulty of the situation. I think that's very striking. So, we now have plenty of time for questions. A microphone is going to be going around. So, the thing to do is to raise your hands. I'm looking into the light, so I may squint a little bit. And then tell us who you are and say something that ends in a question mark.
Hello, my name is David. I'm an American from Chicago. You said several things: invest in good governance, maintain sanctions. This is not a war of resources. Victoria Nuland from the State Department, we know that big oil companies like Chevron are investing hundreds of billions of dollars into Ukraine. We know big food, Monsanto, wants to get into Ukraine because of the quality of the topsoil. Anti-ballistic missiles, Putin himself has said that lethal weapons have already been given to Ukraine. So my question is, where's the proof of Russian aggression? And also, what is the plan to minimize the blowback of Russian and Chinese de-dollarization as a result of maintaining sanctions against Russia?
It's you, not me. Don't look at me, friend.
I'm not going to start on the second question because de-dollarization is a step too far away from what my understanding. If you don't mind, I'm not an economist by any standards, as you can hear. But your first one, how do we, the question, well, first of all, you said, and I'm absolutely sure you're correct, that my point, I think you were correcting my point when I said this is not a war about resources, by saying there are resources issues. Absolutely. I think there always will be resources issues, and President Putin, perhaps of all leaders, has been particularly conscious of resource, as Jim was telling us, of the use of resources as an instrument. So I agree with that, but I think that the point I was trying to make was that in looking for President Putin's trajectory and what he's seeking a difference which is not just about resources. He's seeking a difference in values, and his strategy is not only about seeking access to resources. That's my point. I think it's much more strategic than that and much more difficult than that, in fact, to deal with. I don't think he'll be choosing conflicts because of the resource issues, to put it that way. How do we prove that Russians have, well, Google Earth, I suppose. I mean, it's a very good question because I think we have yet to see a sort of UN Security Council meeting with Senator Kerry coming with photographs of Russian tanks, like we saw in the Iraq case. We haven't actually seen it. It's quite interesting that the claims that are frequently made that the Russians are pouring people across and then the trucks moving and body bags going back. I don't doubt that it's true, by the way, but it's interesting that that there hasn't been an enormous amount of effort to kind of put it in our newspapers. I don't doubt that it's true, and I think one of the very, very alarming aspects to Russian adventurism, as I would put it in Ukraine, is that I was astonished by their willingness to breach international law in such an obvious way. I thought that was remarkable. And then, as time went on, I thought, well, it's not so remarkable because we're not doing much about it, But it is quite a new feature of international diplomacy when there can be such brazen abuse, if you like, of the diplomatic environment. As Senator Kerry said today, I've been lied to my face. I'm sure that's true.
It is the advantage of being one of the permanent members of the Security Council. If you want to commit a brazen act of aggression, it's good to have a veto.
It's good to have a veto, and it's good to have a lot of people to do it with. And as you know, and this was something I learned I was told a lot about when I was in Moscow, an increasing use of draconian laws within Russia to pin down traitors to the state. The famous story about the woman in Russia who overheard Russian soldiers talking about going to Ukraine and phoned the Ukrainian embassy and is now going to jail for 15 years or something. So, we've got a polarizing thing. So I leave the de-dollarization question to Jim because he's more on the...
Thank God I'm asking the questions here.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Olga. I'm Ukrainian. And I can tell you that I know exactly what is happening in Ukraine now. But I'm a little bit confused with this discussion because you probably mentioned all the critical points, but didn't make the correct answer from them. I can tell you that I have a comment and I have a question. My comment is, I know what is happening in Ukraine, and it is a war. It is a real war of a new kind. It is a hybrid, where the most money and resources goes not to the weapon, as you mentioned, and the real destruction counts not by hundreds or thousands of killed, by the million or even the whole nation of poisoned for the present and future generation.
Poisoned.
Poisoned. This is the information war. And this is the biggest risk for all the world, actually, not for like some parts of Europe or Asia or America, because this is a new hybrid, and Putin invests huge money, huge resources in developing this kind of weapon. They use everything. Fake news generating actually became an industry. The game with the only one rule: if the news appeared and rotated more than 1,000 times, nobody cares anymore if it's true or not. They use everything. They use mass media, social networks very actively, internet, so-called Bush telegraph, corrupted reporters throughout the world that write news for the coming day about events that didn't yet happen. And I just want to remind you that your topic is getting Russia to talk about Ukraine. There is no way of getting Russia to talk about Ukraine, just because Russians really believe that we have a kind of dictator regime now, and our people fight for their freedom. And of course, Russia...
So, Olga, if I could ask you, please, to ask a question. I think that was a very important statement, but I think we also need you to ask a question so that Martin has a chance to respond.
I'm coming to my question.
Okay, I'm just worried about time.
You try to calculate in your speech how many times you mentioned the word Ukraine. We came to listen to discussion about Ukraine, and you didn't tell anything, in fact, about Ukraine. As you know, that the biggest issue, the biggest problem is in this informational war hybrid. Why don't you try to have a negotiation partner to take Ukraine as your negotiation partner, to find this common solution without Russia, not about economic, not about military activity, but purely about the thing how to stop this Hydra, actually. This is my question. Why not to communicate directly with Ukraine on this, on information issue?
Thank you. Can I try? I mean, I should have said, I apologize for that, I should have made it clear at sort of the outset that it became very clear to me that my institute was in no position to seriously contribute to mediating peace in Ukraine. It was way above my pay grade, if in a sense. This is something which is being done by the President of France, the Chancellor of Germany, not me. So I should have made that clear, which is why I moved in looking at the subject. It was Ukraine which prompted it, but I moved to the issue of the Russian relationship with Europe. I apologize for not having made that clear. Can I make one further point, however? And I think I did make this. The issue of information is central. I was in Finland and I saw the foreign minister of Finland, who is, as you know, is somebody who's had a huge amount of experience. And he said two things actually of greatest importance for him on this issue. He said, one is the information war. He would have said exactly what you did. And the second is, in fact, exchanges of students, which is an interesting point to be making in this room. The information issue is slowly, I think it is fundamental, rather like it is, by the way, in the way in which we deal with ISIS. A completely different issue, but it's a central focus of conflict resolution and conflict management in the 21st century. It is because of the anxiety, the worry, the concern that European leaders have about the distortion that you describe, that they're considering producing this new great effort to provide a Russian, well, I referred to a Russian service, which is being promoted by 4 European countries: United Kingdom, Denmark, Lithuania, and Estonia. And it's going through all sorts of
Do you think, Martin, that a
negotiations
kind of
in Brussels.
non-propagandistic version of this would be good, and your concern is that it would be done badly?
I would actually like, I hope you appreciate this, I would like my institute to be involved in that project.
Yeah.
Because I think the worry about that project is that it will be propagandist. And I think institutes like mine, Chatham House, and others could helpfully kind of try to guarantee a certain authenticity. I think it's absolutely central to the long war that we'll be fighting in Ukraine, but also not in Ukraine, elsewhere. But I do agree with your core point. The war in Ukraine is as much about information as it is about territory, maybe more.
I'm wondering if the spread that you're worried about from Russia per se, whether it goes in the direction of the Balkans and Eastern Europe, or whether it goes into the Middle East, whether there's something, and this is the first time I'm thinking about it, something even more fundamentally dangerous. Because the fact that there is such support for Putin in Russia is not unrelated, I think, to many major countries that are finding the democratic path much more difficult than they would expect to find it. And the nationalism in China, the nationalism in Iran, the nationalism in Egypt, the nationalism in Syria, is this a war in the long run that's much greater complexity? Because you look at the discussions among our students in terms of what really represents democracy that can work and that can really deliver for the population. And the models that are presented by the Western tradition don't necessarily seem to be as effective as everybody would hope they would be, especially because they can't get established. And so the result is then, well, what is the other value system that you might be thinking of if you're going to get something that the people will profit from? And I worry that what you're talking about, now that you're talking about it, can be more pernicious than even just what's happening in Russia.
Now, I was very lucky on Sunday to be invited into Jim Traub's class in which exactly these discussions were happening from your quite exceptionally gifted students who were arguing that case across the table very, very interestingly and with great reality, given it's such an immediate issue. I think you've raised an incredibly interesting point, because what I think people like me are going to find out, and I'm not a scholar, but I'm a kind of quasi-official, is that we're going to find out that what we're being prompted to think about is a lot more complicated than we thought we had to think about, along the lines that you say. And that what we're prompted to think about is whether democracy as we know it is the, we've had a bit of a free ride on this in the last 20 years. And it's been a wonderful time. And we've done fairly well in certain places and less well in others. In Jim's class, one of the things that came out from your students was that it's not necessarily about the issue of democracy, but it is about the issue of a government which is accountable to the people's aspirations and demands. And the democratic model is one way of responding to it. I think what's going to be exciting, actually, is that Putin's managed government approach is going to force us to defend much more deeply and much more in a much more inspired way the values that we have. And we're going to have to defend it, as you suggest, I think, at government and society level, and we're going to have to defend it in international diplomacy as well. We're not going to have the easy conversations in the corridors of the UN building in New York that we've had for the last 20 years. They ain't going to happen quite so easily. And as you're also suggesting, it's not also going to be just the Russians. Can I just say something on Syria very quickly on this point?
Absolutely.
I worked for the UN on Syria, as you know, for a number of different years. And in the case of Syria, we have a split in the UN Security Council as to what is the right approach. There's a formal agreement on the Geneva process, but in fact a split, as we well know. Now, Russia, China, and a number of other states, Brazil, India, and so forth, took a different view from the US, UK, France, Saudi Arabia, and others. And yet inside the United Nations, and I was an official, the view of the West, if you like, it's not just the West, as you know terribly well in this region, was the dominant view. We're not going to be allowed to get away with that in the future, because Russia and these other nations are going to say, you are our servant just as much as you're the servant of the US. I think there's going to be quite a difference of impact in the culture of international organizations like the UN. I don't think that's so bad. We need to be, Jim and I have been sparring on neutrality and impartiality already this week, but we're going to need to address that issue again.
My name is Mohamed. I'm an advocate for preventive diplomacy. So the entire conflict that we're looking at, you're talking about the conflict mediation, conflict resolution, but not much is being said about conflict prevention, especially the use of preventive diplomacy. And because we saw the tanks coming in, we saw events happening in Syria, we saw the protests coming in, but not much was done on preventive diplomacy side. Do you think there's a potential in doing it, or what would be the lesson learned from the last two conflicts, so those could be applied in the future?
Yes, I do. I mean, I always worry when people talk about preventive diplomacy, because it sounds when you mention it, it's an obvious good, isn't it? It must be the smart thing to do. And my experience, by the way, this is not just about Russia, but my experience, very detailed, down to the gritty discussions about resolving conflict over the last 20 years with a whole range of different governments around the world, is that governments are fundamentally bad at getting ahead of the curve. And preventive diplomacy depends on getting ahead of the curve, doesn't it? So governments are essentially, because of democratic cycles or whatever, there's lots of reasons for it, are very, very poor at seeing ahead of the curve and staunching the wound. I don't think armed groups are much better, but you'd expect governments to have the smarts to get ahead of the curve.
Is the UN much better?
No.
Okay.
Nope. And I think I don't think so. It's very, very difficult. Well, let me give you an example of something that my institute, as I mentioned already, is involved in, which is preventive diplomacy. It's not a subject of great interest globally, but it's Macedonia. Macedonia has two big ethnic groups, Slav and Albanian. They have a tentative peace sewn together 9 years ago, and they're slowly sliding their way back towards conflict. And what we're trying to do is to try to help the not very interested government to do the right thing to get accession to the European Union, which the provisions of which will cement good, tolerant policies and hopefully prevent a slide back to war. Nobody's really interested in this. It's all too kind of over the hill. I remember when I was young and I was in Peshawar, back in the days of the Mujahideen. And I remember a Red Cross worker saying to me, and looking from Peshawar up to the Khyber Pass, and over there is Afghanistan, saying it's only when they're coming over the hill that we get the money to pay the hospital. I think that's still as much today. So there's that. There's a resources issue. Diplomacy is busy. The UN is particularly busy at doing lots of things. The urgent, not the important, as the saying goes. But it's also, I think, because we haven't actually, I think there's a very interesting set of policy work of case studies which will help us understand what preventive diplomacy can do. And I think there's still a very limited range of learning about that, so that I could learn from that and do it a little bit better.
My name is Michael Kramer, and thank you, gentlemen, for your talk, and thank NYU for these wonderful conferences. My question is, if Mr. Putin is promoting a war that includes his values, one of his values that he seems to be using to manipulate or to solidify with the Russian people is religion. And I noticed that he gave a Christmas tree to Notre Dame Cathedral. And perhaps in your next trip
Did he?
to
I didn't know
Moscow,
that.
you might have
What a good guy.
have a word with the patriarch.
I want one too.
Yeah, you might have a word with the patriarch of Moscow.
Yes. Well, you know, there is a wonderful article, by the way, I would commend to you, which is very good for people like me, because very simple, by Carnegie in Moscow on this, the drivers of Putin's policies. And in that article by Dmitry Trenin, who I think is the head of the Carnegie in Moscow, he makes the point that Putin's return to power in 2011-12, when he resumed the presidency, was as a missionary. He was no longer just a manager. He was an incredibly efficient manager, as we remember, in his earlier days. He came back as a missionary, and he had spent, as the article tells us, a lot of spare time kind of shooting the breeze with the patriarch and a particular cleric in Moscow. And he came with a reinvigorated and very, very genuine, it would be wrong, I think, to underplay it, genuine sense of the way in which religion and Russian nationalism have a history of reinforcement. And it was a very powerful a powerful thing. And what the article tells us is that don't think this is about foreign policy alone. This is not just about foreign policy. This is about domestic policy. This is about Russian identity, and in which it's being played out. We just see the foreign bit. Well, what's happening, and what he's aiming for, of course, is a re-establishment of Russian pride and Russian leadership in our world. And he's got a good go for it.
Martin, thank you so much. That was just great. Thanks a million.